Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 766 for May 5th, 2019. Coming up in a few minutes.
The Mid-Atlantic, especially Maryland, has played a huge role in distilling history in America. You know, obviously, bourbon in Kentucky, namely, have really kind of controlled that messaging and had the big voice for all those years. But we think it's time for people to hear the entire story.
Saturday's Kentucky Derby will be memorable for many reasons, including the controversial finish. But race fans heading to Churchill Downs in Louisville got a little jab along Interstate 65. That's because Baltimore's Sagamore Spirit Distillery bought a billboard to pronounce Rye Whiskey as, quote, bourbon's older brother. I'll talk with Sagamore Spirit's Brian Treacy about poking the bear later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. We'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, the calendar of events, your voice, and much more. All on this edition of WhiskyCast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch Whisky, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
Let's get started with the week's news. It's brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. We'll start on the business front. Nelson's Greenbrier Distillery in Tennessee is expected to release its first 4-year-old Tennessee whiskey later this year. And when that happens, it'll be under new ownership. Constellation Brands has upped its stake in the distillery, founded by brothers Charlie and Andy Nelson 5 years ago. And Constellation now has majority control of the distillery. The company invested in the Nelson brothers back in 2016 through its venture capital unit, and Constellation CEO Bill Newlands expects their Tennessee whiskey to fill a hole in the company's portfolio. The Nelson brothers and their team will continue to run the distillery's day-to-day operations. Terms of the deal were not disclosed. Earlier this year, the UK government released customs data showing a new record year in 2018 for Scotch whisky exports, with a value of £4.7 billion. Now, a new report from the Centre for Business and Economic Research shows the Scotch whisky industry's impact on the UK economy is also at a record high, £5.5 billion a year. The Centre's study was commissioned by the Scotch Whisky Association, and the SWA's Graham Littlejohn says it includes the impact of new distillery construction and tourism.
Well, the exports are to a degree factored into this figure. It's not a direct comparison, but in order to get the product to market, we obviously have to use shipping and haulage and marketing, and that is all factored in, assuming they are based in the UK. But this report shows the tremendous contribution that the Scotch whisky industry makes to the UK economy, and of course directly in Scotland as well. A lot of that value in the economy is directly in Scotland, through our distilleries, through our supply chain. And I think this report just underlines what a key sector Scotch whisky is for our economy.
That economic impact is up by around 10% since 2016, and the industry generates more productivity per worker than any other sector of the Scottish economy. The Spirit of Speyside Festival is wrapping up, and the results of this year's Spirit of Speyside Whiskey competition were announced in Elgin too late to make this week's podcast. We'll have the winners next time around. The festival honored 4 Scotch whisky veterans earlier this week for their service to the industry. Retired Gordon and MacPhail Managing Director Michael Urquhart was presented the Spirit of Speyside Lifetime Achievement Award, while Ian Miller of William Grant & Sons was named the Spirit of Speyside Ambassador of the Year. Longtime whiskey writer Charles McLean was named the International Ambassador of the Year, and a new award made its debut this year. Coppersmith Dennis McBain was named the first winner of the Spirit of Speyside Unsung Hero Award. He spent more than 50 years working behind the scenes at the Balvenie and Glenfiddich distilleries. Congratulations to all 4 honorees. Meanwhile, Tamdhu Distillery has released its second bottling of the Dalby Alley Dram, named for the old train station next to the distillery in Speyside. The release comes during the festival and will be available only at the distillery during the festival and on Tamdhu's website for £90 a bottle. That's around $118 at current exchange rates. Now, it's not uncommon to see whiskeys with age statements lose them these days, but what is rare is for a whiskey with an age statement to get an older one. That's what Glenmorangie has done now with its Kinta Reuben port cask finished single malt. It's had a 12-year-old age statement since 2010, but is now being bottled as a 14-year-old whiskey. The whiskey is still being matured for 10 years in ex-bourbon barrels, but the finishing period has been doubled from 2 to 4 years. No change in bottling strength and no change in the recommended retail price of around $60 a bottle. However, the packaging for Kinta Reuben is changing to a green box and label to distinguish it from the 12-year-old version. Compass Box shocked the whiskey world a couple of years ago by releasing a blended malt with no name. Well, no name was the name. Now there's a second edition of No Name being released, and Compass Box plans to use the No Name label on future bottlings of heavily peated whiskeys that don't carry the Peat Monster label. The second batch of No Name is available now in the UK and Europe for around £110, or about $145 a bottle. It'll be priced at $145 when it comes to the US later this year. Other new whiskeys to mention, with hockey's Stanley Cup playoffs in full swing now, J.P. Wiser's has just released the second set of 3 whiskeys in its Alumni series. Part of the proceeds from each bottle go to the NHL Alumni Association's fund that helps retired players who need financial assistance. And just as he did with the first 3 bottles released last fall, honoring Guy Lafleur, Wendell Clark, and Lanny McDonald, Corby Master Blender Dr. Don Livermore worked with 3 more hockey legends for this batch.
It's going to be the Larry Robinson, the next Montreal Canadian player, Paul Coffey, starting with the Edmonton Oilers and the Detroit Red Wings, and the third one that's coming out will be Darryl Sittler for the province of Ontario, certainly the captain of the Leafs. So it's quite exciting. I mean, I get asked across the country about these line extensions and when's mine coming to my city? When's coming to my city? And we'll see where it goes. It's very exciting.
The 3 whiskeys will only be available in Canada, but unlike the first release, all 3 will be available nationwide. The original 3 releases were limited to Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta. Several weeks ago, we answered a listener question about so-called STR casks on Behind the Label, and now Kilchoman is getting ready to release its first STR cask single malt. STR is the term the late Dr. Jim Swan coined several years ago for his shaving, toasting, and recharring process that removes some of the acidity from red wine casks. Kilchoman's STR cask matured 2019 edition was distilled back in 2012, and it's bottled at 50% ABV. It'll go on sale this week for about £80 a bottle. And if you want to taste the difference, try to see if you can find a bottle of Kilchoman's red wine cask bottling from back in 2016. It did not use the STR process. Finally, Ireland's Chapelgate Whiskey Company is launching its latest whiskey. J.J. Corey The Battalion is a blend of 9-year-old grain and 13-year-old Irish malt whiskies, finished in a combination of tequila and mezcal casks. It'll be available in the U.S., Ireland, and other select markets. No word yet on pricing. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com. The news is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Keeping American whiskey history and tradition alive isn't just a marketing slogan, it's part of Heaven Hill's fabric. When other distillers were getting out of the rye whiskey business, Heaven Hill saved the legendary Rittenhouse rye from becoming a footnote in the history books. Today, it's the rye whiskey of choice, in a cocktail or neat, with a distinct spicy flavor all its own. Find out more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. Now, we need your help with something. I've mentioned before how your reviews and ratings for WhiskyCast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and other podcast apps can help other whiskey lovers find the show when they're looking for podcasts. Here is why that is so important. You see, the search results in those apps don't just take into account how long a podcast has been around or how many episodes there are. That's one part of it, but they give more weight to the number of recent reviews and ratings from podcast listeners. In other words, the more actual reviews and comments from listeners, and the more often they come in, the better a podcast does in search results. So, if you've already left a comment or review for WhiskyCast on your favorite podcast app, thanks. But if you haven't, I really hope you'll take a few minutes this week and share your comments. It's just one way you can help us bring WhiskyCast to more people each week. And we really do appreciate your support. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. May's a busy month all over the world of whiskey. The London Whiskey Weekender is this coming weekend, and the inaugural Highland Whiskey Festival kicks off on Friday in northern Scotland and runs through the 17th. Art Begg's Escape Bus Tour is in the Portland, Oregon area with stops on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and Whiskey Live Melbourne is on Friday and Saturday in Australia. Tickets are still available for the Water of Life charity tasting May 16th in New York City. The Scotch Malt Whisky Society's U.S. chapter has 3 Taste of Faygiel tastings, all on May 20th, in New York City, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. The Whiskey Exchange in London hosts Doug McIver of Berry Brothers and Rudd for a tasting at its Fitzrovia store on the 21st. The Campbellton Whiskey Festival is May 21st through the 24th in Campbellton, Scotland. The Hebridean Whiskey Festival is the 21st through the 25th. And, of course, Faygiel, the Isla Festival of Malt and Music, kicks off on May 24th and runs through June 1st. Those are just a few of the 207 different events around the world on our searchable calendar at WhiskyCast.com. Just use the search button on our calendar page to find events near you or wherever you'll be traveling in the months to come.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin. The Kentucky Derby and bourbon go hand in hand. Even in the rain Saturday, Churchill Downs sold more than 100,000 mint juleps, and Lord only knows how many bottles of bourbon the 150,000 people on hand went through. And if the race itself had been a normal one, and we all know it wasn't, Well, the biggest controversy of the day might have been over a certain billboard along Interstate 65 near Churchill Downs. The billboard was for Sagamore Spirit Rye out of Baltimore, pronouncing Rye Whiskey as, quote, Bourbon's older brother. But you see, there's an old saying down south, it's not bragging if it's a fact. The billboard is part of Sagamore Spirit's project to develop a more complete history of whiskey distilling in the United States, and Sagamore Spirit President Brian Treacy joins us with more. Tell me what the reaction has been so far to this billboard. This was kind of a gutsy thing to put right on 65 in the middle of downtown Louisville.
It's been fun. Everything's actually been pretty positive. I think people like the approach. It's different. It's new. It's unique. I don't think people expected a small little brand to go down there, but we've kind of launched this new campaign called Bourbon's Older Brother, aka Bob. And, we've been fascinated with the history of distilling in America since we started this project here at Sagamore Spirit. And, as we learn more and more from the different, archive centers and so forth, it feels very apparent that the Mid-Atlantic, especially Maryland, has played a huge role in distilling history in America. Obviously, bourbon in Kentucky, namely, have really kind of controlled that messaging and had the big voice for all those years. But we think it's time for people to hear the entire story. Between Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, there's such history here of distilling that we thought it'd be fun to take that kind of campaign and bring it to where a lot of people like in Louisville obviously have a lot of interest in and knowledge of whiskey distilling. And so and kind of start that conversation and launch the website whiskey.wiki, where people can kind of weigh in and learn and contribute to that conversation and start to build a comprehensive timeline and set the record straight about the history of American whiskey making.
Well, not to be contradictory, but let me play devil's advocate for a second, because
Sure.
A bunch of us, at least I know, we've always been open and honest and reported the fact that distilling did start on the eastern seaboard in the mid-Atlantic states and through Pennsylvania and all, and then moved west into what is now Kentucky as American settlers moved west, and that rye whiskey was, in fact, when you talk about George Washington's distillery just down the road from you guys in Mount Vernon, we talk about rye whiskey there. I don't think anybody's really putting down or implying that rye whiskey didn't get its due as the original American whiskey.
Yeah, no, a good point, Mark. And I guess that isn't necessarily what I meant how to come out. Is more about, I think, a lot of, let's face it, the bigger brands, the bigger dollars have a bigger voice. And so more people are familiar. How often do you hear people say, well, bourbon can only be made in Kentucky? So there's still a lot of education that I think needs to happen out there. And I don't think people necessarily who do know the history of it by any means deny it. I just think there's a lot of people who still don't know the history. And we've even seen that experience in our visitor center, where we've had the families of some of the distilleries that used to exist here in Maryland come in and talk about some of the things that we have up as far as timelines. And they kind of challenge it, going, that's not the way our family remembers it. And, we'll say, well, the Maryland archives showed us this, and trying to get that information straightened out and making sure that, it's obviously it's been hundreds of years. So documentation, things change, maybe some stories change, but trying to get that documented correctly, because I think everybody across the country, if not the globe, is getting more and more curious about, what they're drinking and where they came from. And there's such a resurgence of rye whiskey now that people don't really know the full story. You obviously do, because you live it every single day. But I'm telling you, out in the market and talking to a lot of the folks, a lot of the consumers, especially newer to rye whiskey, don't know the unique history of it.
And let's go through some of that history, because, in fact, it did start with the early colonial settlers that were primarily making rum from molasses, because that's what they were used to over in England at the time and had access to rum and molasses. But as they started working with the local grains and the folks moved over from continental Europe, they brought rye grain with them, and that's what became rye whiskey.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Absolutely. I mean, I think it was a tremendous amount, if not exclusively rum. And, as things go on, typically the government can get involved here and there. You had the Molasses Tax Act of 1733. And that at that time, people didn't necessarily want to probably pay additional taxes and tariffs and so forth, and maybe not even really want to support the British. Maybe there was a little bit of an uprising against that. And then, like you said, grain from a lot of European settlers came into the U.S. Here in Baltimore, we had the second largest site for immigrants next to Ellis Island. So we had a lot of Scotch and Irish and German, Polish come in who had that rich history of distilling already in their country, and then helped us kind of get more involved in distilling of grains. You're absolutely right. And by, I think, mid late 1700s, I think we really got away from the rum, and in the Mid-Atlantic really started getting into the grain-based products. Even in Maryland, we had the supplier bill of 1756, where they started giving credit and so forth for local distilleries to work with local farmers to buy such grains as rye. So you saw programs kind of put in place like that. And so really kind of pretty obvious that we were making primarily whiskey at the time. And like I said, no one denies it, but, Kentucky wasn't even a state at that time yet. So it's just kind of a cool, fun history that I think a lot of people still don't know.
Oh, of course. And then as people move west, they get writs for land if they grow the native crop, which out there was maize or corn. And then eventually we start switching from corn whiskey into what is bourbon. First reference is 1821, and it goes downhill from there.
You've done your homework.
And Prohibition basically killed off a lot of the rye whiskey distilleries in the Northeast because they didn't get medicinal permits for the most part.
That's right. And then we even had, I believe it was the Agricultural Act of 1933, which kind of, between that and the combination of Prohibition, obviously played another role, especially with some people actually being paid not to grow certain types of grains. And I think occasionally, depending on where you were, some people say it might have been rye.
And then, of course, the 1964 with the Act of Congress declaring bourbon as America's native spirit pretty much put the nail in the coffin for the most part for rye whiskey until only really about 10 years ago.
Yeah, you're right. I think rye was maybe 100,000 cases in 2010, and now we're over 1 million cases a year. So, that's pretty explosive growth, especially for a product that's hard to bring back online with all the aging requirements.
Let's get back to the campaign for a second. Now, we've completely bored everyone with a history lesson. How hard was it for you guys to get a billboard company in Louisville to let you put this billboard up? I think they're pretty friendly overall. I think they're in business to be in business. But I think they definitely scratched their head that, we wanted to put it on I-65, basically on your way from the airport to Churchill Downs, leading up through the Triple Crown season. So I'm sure they had a few good laughs about it behind our back or thought we were crazier than ever. But, we think it's fun. And I've gotten a lot of funny text messages from folks down there. But overall, one thing I've learned since I got in this business is one of the greatest things about this business is how supportive all the different distilleries are of each other. And even though with our relationship with a few different distilleries down in Kentucky, we've had some good banter back and forth and very harmless, but some fun banter back and forth. And people overall are very supportive. Now let's switch the focus a little bit because now that Derby weekend is over, things switch out to you guys out in Baltimore at Pimlico with the Preakness.
That's right.
And you guys are involved with the Preakness Stakes.
Yeah, we have. Obviously, where we get the limestone spring water from at Sagamore Farm to proof all of our whiskeys, it doesn't look like we're going to have a horse necessarily in the actual stakes, Preakness Stakes race, but we always have a few horses racing that day, which is always exciting. So, and of course, Black-Eyed Susan the day before that Friday. So we always go out that weekend and spend time cheering our good friends and partners up at Sagamore Farm and their horses onto wins. And, looks like they should have a very good season. They got a lot of strong runners right now, and we're excited for them and the potential.
Is Sagamore Spirit officially working with Pimlico this year? I know you've been sort of the official whiskey in the past and made the official cocktail in the past too, right?
We have played a role with them in the past. We're not doing that this year. You know, one of the challenges as a small brand like us that's growing is trying to figure out how to deploy those dollars. At the time when we were working with them, it was a great experience. We loved it, but we were really primarily distributed just in like the Maryland, DC, kind of Virginia area. So it made a lot of sense. Now we're in 35 states, and we just have to kind of make every dollar spend like $3 and just kind of make our dollars go as far as possible. So as much as we'd love to play a role in that, we just kind of have to have a wider reach right now. So we're not going to be involved in it this year.
So Sagamore Spirit has outgrown the Triple Crown of horse racing.
I wouldn't say that. We're just trying, different things. Like the Bob campaign is a great example. So we kind of put that in there, kind of start a kind of conversation out there and be part of it. And it's exciting. So we're very excited with the Bob campaign and Bourbon's older brother, and we're going to stay focused on that one for a while.
And thanks to Brian Treacy of Sagamore Spirit for joining us this week on WhiskyCast In-Depth. By the way, Brian will be leading a Sagamore Spirit tasting next week on May 14th at the Lost Property Bar in Hollywood, California. And you can find my tasting notes for the various Sagamore Spirit Rye expressions at whiskycast.com. WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin, the legendary Islay single malt. The final season of Game of Thrones is here. Look for the House Lannister Lagavulin 9-year-old at a whiskey shop near you. It's just one of 8 whiskeys in the Game of Thrones single malt Scotch whisky collection from Diageo and HBO. Check out the entire range at malts.com. Let's start off the What I'm Tasting This Week department with a couple of other rye whiskeys. First up, the Bulleit 12-year-old rye from Diageo. This one is distilled at MGP and uses their 95% rye, 5% malted barley mash bill that is the same one used in the standard Bulleit rye. The difference is that this one is matured for 12 years and bottled at 46% ABV, compared to the no-age statement standard Bulleit rye at 45%. The nose has a slightly herbal touch of dill along with nutmeg, a hint of allspice, honey, vanilla, and oak. The taste is spicy with clove, allspice, touches of cinnamon and dill, along with notes of honey and vanilla in the background. And this one really does benefit from adding just a little bit of water, which rounds out the taste nicely. The finish is medium length with lingering spices. I'm scoring the Bulleit 12-year-old rye an 89. Next up, let's look at the New Riff Bottled in Bond Rye from New Riff Distillery in Newport, Kentucky. This is a companion to their Bottled in Bond bourbon released last year. Of course, it's bottled at 50% ABV. The nose has notes of baking spices, cocoa powder, molasses, and brown sugar, along with just a hint of oak. The taste starts off with a nice chocolatey sweetness at first, followed by a burst of chili powder and allspice, with hints of brown sugar and molasses in the background. The finish is long and smooth with cocoa powder and lingering spices. I'm scoring the New Riff Bottled in Bond Rye a 92. Turning to scotches now. The folks at Whiskey Base in the Netherlands have their own independent bottlings of Scotch whiskies sold under the Archives brand, and I had a chance to taste their cask-strength 2007 Tamdhu. It's bottled at 57.8% ABV, and the nose has notes of dried flowers, honey, straw, vanilla, and just a touch of peaches. The taste is fruity with a good spiciness underneath. Apples and peaches dominate the palate with more subtle notes of cinnamon and allspice underneath, and there are touches of honey and vanilla in the background that hold it all together. The finish is long and well balanced. I'm scoring the Archives Tamdhu 2007 single malt a 92. And let's wrap up with an Irish whiskey, the second batch of Jameson's 18-year-old Bow Street Cask Strength Edition. Batch number 2 is bottled at 55.1% ABV, and just as with the debut batch last year, spends its final year of maturation in the mini warehouse at the Jameson Distillery Bow Street Experience in Dublin. The nose has a good oakiness along with touches of ginger, vanilla, honey, allspice, lime zest, and a hint of chocolate that builds over time. The taste starts off with chocolate and honey notes complemented by allspice, white pepper, and ginger, along with a hint of charred oak in the background for a nice balance and complexity. The finish long with lingering spices and hints of chocolate and honey. I'm scoring batch number 2 of the Jameson 18-year-old Bow Street Cask Strength Edition a 93. I'm adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of nearly 2,600 different whiskeys from all over the world. You'll find it at WhiskyCast.com.
From deep in the north, far beyond the wall, the howl of the frozen wind brings word of something new. A whiskey from the land of always winter, for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch Whisky, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Let's open up the inbox now for Your Voice, brought to you by Lot 40. I saw a discussion the other night on Twitter about a blended Scotch whiskey that does not get a lot of attention. Grand Old Par, 12-year-old from Diageo. Reggie Mobley, at Dr. Fate77 on Twitter, tweeted out a link to a story at punchdrink.com about Grand Old Par, which described it as a little-known Speyside Scotch, and lamented that it's only technically sold in North America, while widely popular in Latin America. Reggie suggested to the Scotchology folks in the Minneapolis area that this sounded like a good idea for a quest. Well, first off, let's clear up a few misconceptions from that article. It's not a Speyside Scotch. Grand Old Par is a blended Scotch whiskey, and the photo with the article clearly shows that. Also, it only took me about 5 minutes to find liquor stores in major U.S. cities stocking Grand Old Par for under $30 a bottle. The article also lamented about the general lack of tasting notes for it online, and that's fair. It's also where I jumped into the Twitter conversation, since I just happened to have a bottle of Grand Old Par on the shelf here in our studio, but for some reason I had never gotten around to reviewing it. Well, we took care of that. You'll find my tasting notes for it now on the WhiskyCast website. And thanks to the gang at Scotchology for this tweet. In any whiskey quest, it helps to know who the other characters are. I believe Mark qualifies as Merlin. Thanks, Mark. I would not go that far, but thanks for the kind words. A couple of weeks ago, our friends at Redbreast had a Twitter giveaway for some of their pocket squares, and to be fair, there were some Redbreast fans that were upset that only U.S. residents could enter the contest. Well, I talked with the Redbreast team after that and asked if we could give away a few pocket squares with no regional restrictions. They sent an entire box over. You'll find the first 4 winners on our Twitter feed this week, but Ryan Campbell at rcampbell919 tweeted this with his entry. This I need so I can wear it in my smoking jacket while I also wear my top hat and monocle while sipping whiskey by the fireplace. 100% true. I want to see a photo of this, and I told Ryan if he posts one, we'll send him a Redbreast pocket square. His response this weekend, deal. Give me a few days. I'm out of state on military duty, but once I'm home, it's monocles and top hats all around. Watch our Twitter feed. If that picture shows up, Ryan's getting a Redbreast pocket square. And Brands, at BrandZ77, was one of several people who appreciated the second chance, tweeting this: "Thanks for thinking of your Canadian fans," inserting a maple leaf emoji. And finally, we had a request from Ava Pang of the Whiskey Bells Whiskey Club in Edmonton, Alberta. The club is working on a charity whiskey tasting to benefit E4C, a local nonprofit working to fight poverty. Now, the tasting will be next spring, but they have come up with a unique idea to auction off a quilt made from distillery T-shirts. And they're looking for distilleries who would be willing to donate a shirt to the cause. I think that's a great idea. And since we do have a lot of distillers who listen to the show, I thought we could help spread the word. If you're interested in donating a T-shirt from your distillery, get in touch with me by email or use the contact form at whiskeycast.com, and I'll pass along all of the details privately. Now, the club would like to have all the shirts in by the end of May so that their volunteer quilter can get to work. And I would really love to see them get distillery T-shirts from all over the world for this project. Thanks in advance for your support. In the meantime, if you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always get in touch with us on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's wrap up this episode with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and other stuff that all combine to make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. I found this question on Quora.com and thought I could help clear up some of the confusion. The question: is a smoky whiskey the same as a peaty whiskey? The answer is not necessarily. The flavors are distinct, and there are a couple of different ways to get those flavors, depending on what kind of whiskey you're drinking. Peaty whiskeys are, by their very definition, smoky. They get their smell from the peat smoke used to dry malted barley, and that infuses the wet grain with that smoky aroma that many of us love, that can differ depending on what type of peat is used in the fire. Peat from Islay will differ in composition from peat harvested in other parts of Scotland, just as they differ from each other because of the different types of native vegetation that decayed over thousands of years in the peat bogs. It is also possible, though, to dry malted barley with wood smoke and impart a woody aroma to the grain, though this is rarely done. After all, many Scots burn peat in their fireplaces because of the relative lack of firewood. There is nothing to stop it from being done, though. And we do have a couple of examples from outside of Scotland. Sweden's Mackmyra distillery likes to add juniper branches into its drying fires, which adds a slightly herbal note to the whiskey. And Balcones Distillery in Texas has done something similar with mesquite wood smoke in a proprietary process for some of its whiskeys. Now, it is also possible to get a smoky note in whiskey by using heavily charred oak barrels in maturation, and this is quite common with bourbons and other U.S. whiskeys that have to be matured in new oak. While that charcoal layer on the inside from the charring process helps filter out impurities in the spirit over time, it can also add a touch of campfire smoke-like aroma to the whiskey as well. If you have something you'd like us to look at on Behind the Label, just use the contact form at whiskeycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot, a unique triple distilled premium Irish whiskey, combining single malt and single pot still. First fashioned in the 1700s and still a rarity today. Sure, as we say in Ireland, what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
That's all for this episode of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com, along with our WhiskyCast HD videos and the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast. That's also where you can catch up on the latest whiskey news, check out our tasting notes, and go through our complete archive of past episodes all the way back to 2005. In addition to leaving a review or rating for WhiskyCast on your favorite podcast app, please take just a minute this week to tell your whiskey-loving friends about WhiskyCast. If they don't listen to podcasts, show them how to use the podcast app on their smartphone to discover the show and a whole world of free content. Remember, friends don't let friends miss out on podcasts. We'd love to hear from you. Get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast, or you can email us. The address is comments@whiskycast.com.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch Whisky, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2019, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.